Let's go.
So for all of Alfred August, we're going to be exclusively making jokes about the new Cats trailer. That was your cue to start singing Memory, Evelyn. No, I'm just kidding.
I only know like the first handful of words to that song, so.
Which is ironic because it's definitely like the middle of the song that you sing.
You could say it's not stored in my memory.
Oh my god, yes! Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Gentlemen for Cinephiles. It is Alfred August, the end of week 1 of Alfred August, to be exact. How excited are you, Evelyn?
I am. My butt cheeks are clenched.
So clenched. So we are here today to talk about The Lodger. It is an early Hitchcock film. It was actually a silent film, and Hitchcock describes it in Hitchcock Truffaut as the first truly Hitchcock film. So we're here to discuss what that means, where it's at in his oeuvre, and yeah, so I think Hitchcock had at least 7 films before this. He had a pretty big handful of films before this, and he also started off actually in silent film making intertitles for the silent movies. So that is like the little like inserts of dialogue that you'll see in silent films. Like that, like say the dialogue that they're speaking. Those Hitchcock made those in Britain before he was a filmmaker. But yeah, Evelyn, The Lodger. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. So, yeah, we kind of discussed it. He describes it as his first Hitchcockian film, and I think it's having taken that class where we watched not all of Hitchcock's films, but a lot of them.
Yeah.
It is
a ton of movies.
because like it's really interesting to see so many of the ideas that he carried through his entire film career already kind of starting to take form here, because he's like with Kubrick, you see a bit where he did a few films and he kind of took a little bit to figure out where he was. And I guess again we mentioned Hitchcock had worked on like 6 or 7 films before this, but it still feels like a really early point in time, and yet he seems to have a lot of what he was going to become already sort of locked down and sort of moving towards that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then also, like, I mean, it worked as like a prototype in a lot of different ways for his film work, for sure. I think The Lodger was a good safe space between like, because at the time of The Lodger, this new type of studio system is starting to develop. It's not quite full-fledged Hollywood studio system like where we see Hitchcock later on thrive, but it's this kind of like first stepping stone to that. So you have like the lead actor, Ivor Novello. He plays this lodger who comes in, and the whole point of the movie is there's this murderer a la Jack the Ripper who's murdering women, and this lodger comes into town, this like super mysterious lodger, nobody knows who he is, and it's super up in the air of if he was or was not the killer. But you see him have a lot of early issues with the Ivor Novello being the one playing this, because he was set up as like a leading man who couldn't play that type of role, I guess. And what other film did Hitchcock run into that with? I keep forgetting. It's the one with Cary Grant.
Suspicion, I think.
Suspicion, yeah, I think so too. Yeah. But it's like it kind of serves as a first way also for him to develop his style in terms of looking at all the themes he wants to do. It's a studio system light, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's like the little leagues before you get to the big leagues, I guess. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Go for it, Evelyn.
No.
Oh yeah, Evelyn, you had some techniques you wanted to talk about. Particularly, the thing that's interesting. So yeah, there is the mistaken identity that you talked about, and like this play on like what it means to be a villain in a narrative.
Okay, yeah. Because we were talking about sort of the roots of that, because there's kind of a like not undercurrent, I guess subtext in most of Hitchcock's work about either mistaken identity or kind of being in the face of a society that doesn't see things, doesn't see the full reality. Mm-hmm. And you see that start here with Ivor Novello, because he may or may not be the Jack the Ripper murderer, but he like by the end of the film, like everyone except the female lead, whose name I can't remember, is pretty much everyone except her is certain he's the murderer and is coming after him. And so we talked about Hitchcock's in his early life. He, I guess his dad would like punish him by like if he broken rules or whatever. His dad would be like, okay, we'll take you to the police station and they'll put you in a police cell for a little while.
Yeah.
And that
Which is a
basically
crazy thing to deal with as a kid.
But it's also kind of, I feel like, the root of a lot of Hitchcock's issues with like family structure and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's also, that was kind of what Hitchcock says sort of planted in him this idea of being a kid who gets put in a jail cell like that, sort of planted in him this idea of sort of being condemned for stuff you didn't do, and like that kind of a fear of that. And he works through that in The Lodger here, and then in the 39 Steps, where he's the main character is also branded as a criminal, and then pretty much throughout his whole filmic career, there's this idea of sort of mistaken identities and people not understanding the whole truth through Psycho, where people are after the one woman or where we kind of think, I guess Psycho is kind of a subversion of that, so it's not the best example, because it's I think on some levels it turns that around where we aren't understanding the full reality until a bit later, but and then again in North by Northwest, kind of the same thing happens where he gets caught in this web and is everyone's telling him that he's not who he says he is, and so it's something that runs through all of Hitchcock's work, and I think this was the first time he really started exploring that, even if he didn't get to it as definitively as in some of his films. Because what's interesting about Ivor Novello's character is that we never know for sure whether he was the murderer or not, whereas in most of Hitchcock's other films, even if things are kind of gray and fuzzy, we tend to, by the end of the film, sort of know where everybody is. So that's sort of something that sets this film apart.
100%. And it's so important too, because I think that an interesting thing too, extending with Hitchcock's super strong storytelling so early on, it reminds me of a Quentin Tarantino or a Martin Scorsese, and I think, while all these auteurs develop their styles in a different way, I think the one thing that they all share is this really strong love and understanding of the cinema as a whole. And so, having Hitchcock, he was very open about his influences going into The Lodger, especially, but also with all of his filmmaking work. And he always cites German Expressionism, which you see a lot of ties to German Expressionism, whether it's, the super strong German Expressionist artistic style of just the sets and the dark shadows and the makeup, et cetera, or even, the more thematic elements of the German Expressionist film, like, mob mentality, groupthink, those types, anti-technology, those types of things.
Yeah.
You get that thread, but then you also get Alice Guy Blaché, which is, I think, a reason why Hitchcock is so good at storytelling so early on, because he has a female filmmaker like Alice Guy Blaché where he's able to look to. While there's not a lot of films we have now that we can access of hers, she was the first pioneer of narrative cinema. While everybody was out filming, everyone was out filming, a train station or, people leaving work, Alice Guy was putting together narratives and filming them. And having a female figure like that, who's already developing stories and already subverting stories, et cetera, having that to look up to, I think, is part of what makes Hitchcock so dynamic, so quick.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that's not only something that helped him stand out at this early point, but that's something, like, if you think about how long Hitchcock was making movies from, this point in the late 20s, early 30s through into his last films in like the 70s. That's a very like long time for him to be not just making movies, but also like still relevant and still like if you look at his films, every film feels kind of connected to the time it was made. It doesn't feel like at one point I'm the person on this podcast who actually likes some Spielberg movies, but like if you think if you look at Spielberg
I'm
movies,
getting slandered on my own podcast.
well, I don't want to make this like a thing of me like beating on Steven Spielberg because I feel like that is a thing on this podcast. But
We
like
love
if
you,
you look
Steven,
if you look at his films, like they all kind of have they all like fit in this certain kind of stylistic era and sort of. I'm trying to think of a word that's not one of those like $10 college words.
Use a $10 college word.
Like I don't know that.
And then we'll make it
there's a
accessible.
certain go back to oeuvre that sort of like sticks out in a Spielberg movie where it feels very reminiscent of the same kind of movies that he was making in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Whereas with Hitchcock, he evolved over time, and I think a lot of that is because even at the beginning, he was always aware of sort of. Excuse me.
Oh, okay.
Because he was always aware of the sort of film culture that surrounded him. So in the early like 20s when film was still kind of figuring itself out, he was aware of the people then, but he kept. I think a lot of people get kind of tunnel vision as they go into an industry, but Hitchcock was able to kind of maintain this awareness even into like Rope, where he's not Rope. Well, like he did bring that into Rope, but Frenzy, where he kind of took influence from people like Kubrick, who like was around for a little bit, but far earlier than Hitchcock made Frenzy. But that was when Kubrick was really starting to make a name for himself, and Hitchcock maintained that awareness even into his older age, and I think that's something that sets his cinematic language apart.
Mm-hmm. No, that's completely, I completely agree.
I used a lot of words to say that.
That was like so good, you know? So good. Wow. Are you like a filmmaker? Okay, so we need to talk about, now also in terms of his style, he makes a cute little cameo in this, and I think that's interesting that like, he makes his cute little cameo. But I would love to talk about when we saw this for the first time, Evelyn. Oh. Could you walk us through this, please?
Yeah, so there is like this film has been restored for the Criterion Collection. There are there are releases you can get, but it is also as an early public domain silent film available on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And so when we were watching it for class, the teacher just he pulled a video off of YouTube, and it was like.
It was so long, I'm so sorry.
It was kind of they picked some music that seemed mostly fitting or whatever until the scene where the lodger and this female lead kind of start having their first romantic interactions. Yeah. And it goes into this like sort of 90s softcore porn kind of like soft rock music. It sounds a lot like a Poe song if any y'all are in the 90s alternative crowd, but so like it was just like I think something that kind of stuck in the mind of anyone in that class, which also like kind of opens up a whole other wormhole about the fact that like with silent films you can literally like if you want to just put any music you want to them, and that's creatively that's a whole thing. Like you mentioned like something about the DJ Spooky cut of Dr. Caligari, and that's I did some research onto that, and that's kind of amazing actually, but
he also did one for Birth of a Nation, I think. Yeah,
which is really interesting when you have like a black kind of hip hop influenced guy doing a cut of Birth of the Nation, but that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, no, straight up, that's a whole other podcast. And D.W. Griffith, if you're out there ghosting around, we're coming for you. We are coming for you. We're coming for you. Anyway.
So yeah, The Lodger.
The Lodger is so good. It's excellente. It's excellente. You should go watch it right now.
Ivor Novello can stay in my house anytime.
He can lodge up in my house. I think the other thing we would love to talk about, that I think we should talk about, is the strong woman element.
Okay, yeah.
Because I do think it is very interesting that the film, from very early on, Hitchcock is showcasing strong women, and it may not be strong women in the same way we look at women now, but just, women with a large degree of agency. I always think there's this one particular scene where, so this lodger is staying in a house, and the daughter of the two people who run the house, kind of like they have this romantic thing going on, like Evelyn talked about. And when he is kind of pinned for this, like, mistaken identity, it could be him, blah, blah, blah. She goes to go after him, and her parents stop her and are like, no, you can't do this, you can't do this. There's a very long shot, which is very interesting for a silent film, and it's not something you really, the kind of long shot close up that you see isn't a very, like, normal thing. And it's straight up, it's a focus on a woman making a decision, and she decides to do what people aren't telling her to do, which is so interesting.
Yeah. And also, I think the fact that she's she doesn't necessarily succeed, but the fact that she's a woman making a decision to save a man in peril at this early point in film is really, really interesting too.
Yeah, 100%. Could you go into that a little more?
Yeah. So she's a woman making a decision to save a man. But yeah, I think that's like a lot of things in The Lodger. It's very much like kind of the prototypical seed for the complete like fern that would become Hitchcock's sort of ideology and the ideas he would explore, because like we could talk all day about every one of his films is very much about sort of a strong woman, a woman who has his female characters are typically, there's always the one female character who has that kind of insight that the rest of the cast, typically the primarily male cast, sort of fails to see, and even the like male protagonist only gets that insight when he kind of connects with the female character. And in The Woman here, you kind of are already seeing that, where everyone else is like, I'm pretty sure this guy's the murderer, and she's like, well, I don't know about that. I want to go talk to him, and I want to trust him, and that's. Yeah, it's an early exploration of the ideas that Hitchcock would explore, and again in The Lady Vanishes, where you have the whole concept is this female character saying, "I saw this," and everyone's saying that doesn't make any sense, and then on and on for pretty much every single Hitchcock film.
Yeah, and there's also a very strong Freudian kind of lens on it too. That is kind of Hitchcock putting his toes into that, I think. And it has to do with the brother-sister dynamic, because it comes off like weirdly incestuous in a lot of ways. Thoughts?
I'm trying to remember that. I don't remember this part of the film.
There's like a flashback.
Oh, okay, with
and there's like
the
a
lodger's
weird
sister.
energy between them. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's one of those things of like us as Americans dissecting like European interactions.
That is also 100% true. That is 100% true. But yeah, that's super. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also agree. And then in terms of it is a silent film, but it plays around with the silent film formula a lot already, which I think is just a testament to. I think it's just a testament to. I think it's a testament to Hitchcock's like mastery of the cinema so quick. And it's just there's not a lot of intertitles. A lot of it's done very visually, which is just super normal for Hitchcock, which is really interesting that he started off so strong in terms of visual.
Yeah, well, I think again that comes back to because he spent a lot of time working We kind of talked about before recording the fact that it's interesting he started out as an intertitle guy, and this film, it does contain some intertitles, but it doesn't really rely on them all that much.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder if kind of being, because I'm not really sure, like I don't have the historical knowledge of what exactly the intertitles kind of entailed, if that was something. But I almost wouldn't be surprised if he kind of learned some lessons from sort of watching these films as he or sort of observing, I guess, the creation process and sort of seeing what did and didn't work visually before he even got started on his own stuff.
Yeah, no, that's 100%. That's 100% true. And while there were some issues going on, I think it's a very, very good kind of introduction to Hitchcock as a filmmaker, because I do agree with Hitchcock in that this is kind of, I've seen a couple of his earlier silent films. I think I've seen a couple of his earlier silent films, and they don't really feel very Hitchcock. They kind of feel like, they feel a little B-movie, I guess. I guess they feel like silent film B-movies. If that makes sense. But so this it really starts off the road of Hitchcock. I mean, obviously you should watch other Hitchcock films before, you can watch other Hitchcock films before, and they're all part of his thing. But I do think this one, if you're looking at Hitchcock films in terms of his style, this is the first one to watch.
Yeah, this is definitely the point at which he kind of, this is like his Batman Begins moment. This is like the other films were Bruce Wayne traveling the world learning to fight, and this is Bruce Wayne returning to become Batman. I just made a Batman analogy with Hitchcock.
I love that. I love that though.
But yeah.
But yeah, it was just pretty solid.
Yeah. Also, it's interesting you connected his early work to B movies, because I remember we were talking about back when we took that class, there was some discussion about parts of The Saboteur.
Yeah.
Feeling almost like a lot of his actors feeling like they wouldn't be out of place in a B movie, and he took them in directions that weren't B movie directions, but he had that feel, and I think some of that is just because Hitchcock is kind of someone who's not he definitely liked working within the studio system and liked having his own set of rules, but he's also not scared of sort of playing outside of convention, and so I think he almost kind of connects to sort of the B movie world sometimes in that way of he's not afraid to reach out to those weird outside elements and pull something from them just as much as he would the tradition, sort of.
Yeah, and there are a lot of times that he uses it to his advantage, like you were saying. You know what I mean? And it's a deliberate decision. For Hitchcock, because he's so rooted in the studio system, using B-movie actors like that is a deliberate decision.
Yeah, to take it. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting element of Hitchcock's filmmaking as well that kind of starts to come out during this.
Yeah, again, it's interesting just how much of his future you can kind of see reflected in the Lodger, because you also have you talked about at the start of the podcast, his struggles casting this Ivor Novello, this well-known leading male, as someone whose ethics are suddenly questionable when he's always been the hero up until this point. And then kind of having to go through that same thing with Cary Grant several years later.
Yeah, no, 100%. 110%. Those are some good points, Evelyn. Are you like a filmmaker?
It's almost like
studied movies.
It's almost like I borrowed that point from you last time we recorded this.
Oh my God, we weren't going to talk about that, but Evelyn, do you want to explain what happened with the recording? yeah, Erynn, you could actually cut that out, please. Yeah, no, I feel that that's okay. That's a me. But yeah, lit.
Yeah. So yeah, the Lodger. It's really good.
Real good, yeah.
And it's on YouTube, so like you literally have no reason to not go check it out. It's not even, what's its runtime?
It's like an hour? Couple hours?
Hour 32 minutes. Okay, so it's like normal.
A couple
film
hours? Did you just hear me say that? A couple of hours? What on earth am I
It's only the length of the extended edition of Infinity War. It's not even.
Straight up. That's nothing. Just turn it on. It's going to be amazing. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and iTunes. Evelyn, where can they find you?
You can find me on EV Override on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, where I should have some new gaming stuff up, and also on Cineborg Productions, or I should have some new filmmaking stuff up, also on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook.
Yes, Evelyn, we stand. And I will see you guys, like I said, Saturday. Bye.
Bye.